Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our stories of Pensacola, North America's first place city. This time we're talking about the early period of American ownership of Florida. And in prior episodes, we talked about the coming of the military here, about the establishment of churches, about our participation in the Mexican War, and of course the evolution of issues which began to fester across the entire United States as we proceeded through the 1850s. Now, as we talked about some time back, Pensacola tried to build one of the early railroads in North America. This was in the 1830s. The Alabama, Florida, Georgia had been planned, work had begun, but all had perished in the panic of 1837. But people locally did not give up, and especially Captain, who now was Colonel Chase, who was still active with the military but just about to retire. He now became one of the members of a driving force to begin a new railroad. This one was to be built from Pensacola to what was then called Pollard Junction, which was just a little bit east of what is present-day Flomaton. Charles Pollard was the president of a new organization called the Mobile and Montgomery Railroad, which was being constructed from Mobile northeast through Montgomery and then on up toward Richmond. And the idea was to build a combined railroad network with Pensacola to join the Mobile and Montgomery at the Pollard Junction. So Mr. Chase, doing the same things that he had done before, began fundraising, which he did beautifully. And of course, by the time we get to this, all began in 1853. By the time we get to 1856, the money had been raised and work began. And so beginning in that year, slowly but surely, the track was constructed from the Pensacola docks up to the northeast. Well, as all this was going on, of course, the entire country was being sucked into a kind of a vacuum of despair. The issue of tariffs, slavery, states' rights were becoming paramount elements, and as we proceed into the year 1858, all of this was really taking focus very sharply. And people in the South were talking about it, people in Pensacola were. Not that people here were particularly excited about it. We have to get a kind of a profile on what our city was. At that point in time, a census had been taken, and we had about 2,950 people total residents of Pensacola, of which just under 1,800 were white and the balance were slaves. There were practically no Native American population left in the city at that time at all. Okay, we move to the election of 1858, not a presidential election, but an election which had a great focus in another part of the country, and that, of course, was in the state of Illinois. There, two mental giants were in opposition to each other, seeking the United States Senate seat. One was Stephen A. Douglas. They called him literally, that was the nickname he had, was the Little Giant. And the other was young Abraham Lincoln, who had been a member of the national legislature, had been part of the Illinois legislature, and was making quite a name for himself as a lecturer. Well, the two men came together in a series of debates which were held all over the state. And from Pensacola's standpoint, and this was, of course, was true across much of the South, those debates became a very important factor, because by now another gentleman whose name I have no idea of had invented a process which they called electrotyping. And basically, an electrotype was in an electrotype. One made a kind of a mesh sheet with a consistency something like you would have in an egg carton. And then a newspaper publisher would take the full page composition in hard type and put that under pressure on the matte type, and there would be literally a composition there. Now that electrotype matte could then be sent by whatever method they could, railroad probably, to a publisher such as Mr. Drake here in Pensacola, Mr. Wright rather, and he could then pour hot lead into that mat and come up with a plate that could be put on his printing press and run an entire page of material. This was a magic change Because for the small county newspaper, this meant they could get and print all kinds of things that they couldn't get otherwise. This is where the crossword puzzle was invented, was used first. And they, you got such things as recipes and stories. This was, but the thing what we're interested in, of course, is this was how and where the Lincoln-Douglas debates appeared in weekly newspapers. And from one side of the Florida to the other, people were able to get their weekly paper, read this, and they could see what Lincoln and Douglas were saying. Well, that made quite an impact, as one can imagine. And so basically, our governor at that time, a man named Madison Perry, was very, very concerned. He could see trouble coming. So at this point in time, with the railroad being built on our side and seeing other potentials for Florida in a new southern arrangement, Mr. Perry ordered the creation of a militia. Now, remember, Florida had been a part of the United States as a state for 15 years. We had had no such thing as a militia, and now a militia was being formed, and once again, Colonel Chase, who must have been a very busy man at this point, was named the commanding officer of the militia and ordered to form a troop of men. And this beginning in the early part of 1859, he did exactly that. Well, we move forward. As the year, month by month, the railroad begins to inch its way north. The other railroad, the Montgomery and Mobile, is moving its way forward as well. And now people began to talk about what if there should be a division, north and south? What if they divided? What would happen? How would, and of course, those who remember the great novel Gone with the Wind will recall that in one of the early stages, when that novel was converted into a motion picture, Rhett Butler stood up when the war talk was coming forth and warned people that yes, the South was full of patriotism, but they didn't have cannon factories, they didn't have steel mills and all the rest, and that their eastern ports could easily be blockaded. But Pensacola might be something else, because as people reason, number one, had this wonderful harbor. It had a dock down here ready for use. It had military components which were of great value in defense, and it was about to have a railroad. Put them all together, and this might mean that Pensacola could become a principal source of supply for a new country, or a country at war, if that should happen to come. And so people began to talk about this in Pensacola's way, and at that point, we get into 1859 for this, or maybe just even a little bit later. At this point in time, Pensacola became a front page story. Now, at this point, across the United States, there were two weekly newspapers that were the equivalent of USA Today. They came out weekly. They were beautifully done. One was called Leslie's Illustrated, and the other was called Harper's Weekly. And they were illustrated by beautiful hand engravings. I don't know how in the world these men could do so much so fast, but they did. Of course, this is before you could use photography in newsprint. But these men came forth with all sorts of drawings and illustrations. And they began to show Pensacola as they envisioned it. But bear in mind now, none of them had ever been there. When they drew a picture of Fort Pickens, it was just drawn from their imagination. The city itself was in their imagination. But they began telling stories about this is a place that you've got to keep on the front page, right in front of you, if something bad should happen. Okay. We move forward through the year 1860, and we get into the month of May. And in that year, the Democratic Party held its presidential nominating convention in Baltimore. They came together, and they could not agree on a candidate. They met for day after day after day, ballot after ballot, and they could not agree, and they adjourned. Two other meetings would be held by that party over the next 60 days, and ultimately the Democrats nominated three different presidential people, chief of whom was young Stephen A. Douglas, whom had opposed Abraham Lincoln in Illinois 2 years before. The Republican Party, of course, nominated, after just a couple of ballots, they nominated Mr. Lincoln, meeting in a brand new facility that the city of Chicago had built called the Wigwam, great big tabernacle, wooden tabernacle. So now we had Mr. Lincoln running against Mr. Douglas. Well, at this point on, of course, newspapers like the Gazette here in Pensacola covered the story, what was going on in the election area beautifully, because electrotyping made that possible. There was no email, no faxes, no Associated Press service back then, but the electrotyping did a wonderful job. It was somewhat prejudiced in the points of view the way they put them, but nonetheless there they were, and people were ready. Well, now we come to the month of November in 1860, the election. And you can kind of imagine what it must have been like then here in downtown Pensacola. We had the telegraph into Pensacola by this time, and all the business leaders were gathered in here that night as a tick, 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 tick of the telegraph came across, giving them the results. And by late that night, they pretty well knew that things had been settled. Abraham Lincoln, whose name had not even appeared on the ballot in many of the southern states, had won a majority of the Electoral College votes. He hadn't won a popular vote majority, but he had won enough states to win the presidency. The other three men had totally split the Democratic balloting. So Mr. Lincoln is going to become the president. And now people are beginning to say, well, what did he say in the Lincoln-Douglas debates? Where do we stand in the South? Well, this means we are in for trouble. And so within 3 weeks, the legislature of the state of South Carolina came together, and they announced that they were seceding from the Union. 2 weeks later, the legislature in the state of Mississippi convened and did exactly the same thing. Meanwhile, here in Florida, people were uncertain. This was not a major slaveholding state. People, so far as I've ever been able to determine, people here weren't concerned so much about that. They were more concerned about tariffs and the cost of living than they were about the other issues. But nonetheless, they were brought into this same vortex of opinion, and we move forward. And now, when we come to the middle of December, Governor Perry sends out a notice to all of the members of the legislature: you are to convene in Jacksonville, in Tallahassee, on the 3rd of January for a meeting, one subject only, to discuss possible secession from the Union. Well, you can imagine what it must have been like over the Christmas holidays. People are very disturbed. They don't know what to think. What is going to come out of this? And of course, as all of this begins to happen, people who are being very wise are beginning to hedge their bets. They're beginning to say, well, what'll happen to us if? How can we make money on this? How can we safeguard our family? But anyway, it all proceeds forward. And by the time we get to January the 3rd, it's almost a non-issue. The legislature convened, and one of the first men to speak was old Mr. William P. Duval, who had been the second territorial governor. He's an old man now, and he gets up and he begs with people, don't secede. We've only been part of the Union for 15 years. It's been all to our benefit. We are going to look for trouble if we do this. But he was pretty much shouted down. And after about 7 days of debate back and forth, the balloting is taken, and the Florida legislature agrees to secede from the Union. We are the 3rd state to do so. Now the question is, what are we going to do next? There is no Confederate States of America to join, so the legislature agrees to go back to a situation that had taken place years before. They divided the state or the territory in half, and there was to be East Florida and West Florida. And so for the next roughly 6 weeks, we became, here in West Florida, we became the Republic of West Florida. We had our own flag. We put ourselves together with the semblance of a governing body, and we did those things that we would do in preparation for they knew not what, because people still hoped fervently that there would be no violence, no war. And so that's the way things stood on the 10th of January. And at that point, Governor Perry called Colonel Chase and said, now I order you to call to arms all of the militia. And I want you to, you'll have bodies that will work at the other places in South Florida, the Mariana Arsenal, but I want you to occupy all of the military functions, all of the forts, all of the Navy Yard here at Pensacola. So beginning the following day, Mr. Chase calls his men to arms, and by that evening, about 600 people are gathered here ready to drill and take charge.